When I bought the house in Maple Ridge Estates, I was just looking for peace. After years of living in busy downtown Atlanta, I wanted a quiet place to unwind, somewhere with open skies, fresh grass, and neighbors who waved instead of honked. Maple Ridge seemed perfect at first, neatly trimmed lawns, clean sidewalks, and homes that looked like they came straight out of a real estate magazine. My name's Mark, and after spending over a decade building my company, a regional internet service provider that served several southern states, I finally decided to slow down. Or so I thought. I didn't expect that my biggest challenge after moving wouldn't be business competition or network issues, but a woman named Karen, the head of our HOA. From the first week, I could tell she was the type who loved control. You could hear her voice before you saw her, sharp, commanding, and always filled with that passive-aggressive charm that only certain suburban tyrants seem to master. The very first morning after I moved in, she appeared at my door, clipboard in hand, bright pink lipstick marking her coffee cup as she smiled like a shark in pearls. "Hello, new neighbor," she said, her tone far too cheerful to be genuine. "Welcome to Maple Ridge. I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Karen, the head of the Homeowners Association. We like to keep things orderly around here." I remember nodding politely, thinking it was just a friendly visit. I was wrong. That clipboard was practically a weapon. She started listing HOA regulations like she was reading the 10 Commandments: lawn height, trash bin placement, mailbox color, fence paint shades. I had barely unpacked my boxes, and she was already scolding me about the color of my porch light. At first, I tried to play along. I had dealt with worse personalities in corporate negotiations, and a retired suburban busybody didn't seem like much of a threat. I thanked her for the information, smiled, and said I'd be sure to keep things in line. But she wasn't done. Over the next week, she made it her personal mission to remind me that everything in Maple Ridge went through her. She'd knock on my door to complain that my contractor's truck was blocking the view, send emails reminding me that we discourage certain lawn decorations, and even left a note taped to my garbage bin that said, "Bins should be curbside no earlier than 7 a.m. sharp." I laughed it off, until the day she crossed a line she never should have. It started one Saturday morning when I noticed my internet was acting up. It wasn't a big deal, it happens sometimes, but after rebooting my modem and router twice, the connection was still completely dead. I pulled up the diagnostics, and the system showed a line cut. Not a disconnection, a physical cut. That immediately set off alarms in my head because I knew exactly how the infrastructure worked. The main fiber ran underground and surfaced at a small junction box near the edge of my property, just beside the sidewalk. It was protected by a discreet green pedestal and was clearly marked, "Property of Southern Net Communications." I designed those boxes myself years ago. So, I grabbed a flashlight and went to check it. What I found made my blood boil. The cover of the box was half open, and my fiber line had been snipped clean through, not by accident, not by weather, but by someone who knew what they were cutting. The wire ends were sheared in a straight line, and one of them was still dangling. But that wasn't even the worst part. There was a small note tucked into the box, written on HOA letterhead. It said, "Unauthorized cables on HOA property must be removed. Please reroute your connection appropriately. Karen, HOA President." I stood there for a full minute in disbelief, holding that note like it was evidence from a crime scene. My unauthorized cable wasn't some random line, it was the main fiber backbone for my own internet provider, a legitimate, licensed utility connection that serviced not only my house but part of the neighborhood's network. And she had just cut it with her garden shears, apparently thinking she had the right to. That level of arrogance was impressive even for an HOA president. I tried to calm down and reason it out. Maybe she didn't know what it was. Maybe she thought it was a private cable. But no, the warning labels were bright and clear. She had to have ignored them deliberately. I called the HOA office first to try and sort it out calmly. The receptionist hesitated when I asked for Karen. She's in a meeting," she said nervously. "Can I take a message?" I told her what happened, that my fiber line was cut, that it was clearly an HOA action, and that I expected an explanation. By that afternoon, I got an email response from Karen herself. The tone was dripping with smug authority. "Dear Mr. Anderson, thank you for bringing this to our attention. The HOA discovered a non-compliant cable installation running across shared property lines. Our maintenance team was instructed to remove it for safety reasons. You may reinstall your service line after submitting a written request for review." I could practically hear her self-satisfied tone through the screen. That was it. She just cut a legal fiber line that was literally part of the infrastructure I owned, and now she was acting like she had the right to regulate it. That evening, I walked over to her house. Her front yard looked like a garden catalog, trimmed bushes, pastel flowers, everything symmetrical to the inch. She answered the door with that same tight smile. "Oh, Mark," she said, folding her arms. "I figured you'd come by. Don't worry, we'll approve your line once you fill out the request." I remember taking a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Karen," I said slowly, "you didn't just cut my internet cable. You cut the main fiber line for Southern Net, the company I own. That line runs part of your neighborhood's network." Her face froze for a second, the smile twitching. "Oh, don't be ridiculous," she said finally, waving her hand. "That can't be true." I pulled out my phone and showed her photos of the label and the registered utility tag. "You just damaged company property," I told her. "And if you'd bothered to check before cutting, you would have known it's illegal to tamper with any registered communication line." She crossed her arms tighter, trying to recover her composure. "Well," she sniffed, "maybe your company should ask permission before digging through HOA grounds." I had to laugh. "Karen," I said, "that's not how utilities work. You don't own the right-of-way." But she wasn't done digging her hole. "If you think threatening me with your little company will scare me," she said sharply, "think again. The HOA has rules, and you're not above them." That was the moment I realized reasoning with her wouldn't work. She wasn't just ignorant, she was convinced of her own power. So, I decided to handle it my way, the way we handle things in business when someone messes with our infrastructure. I told her, very calmly, "You'll be hearing from our legal department soon," and walked away. By the next morning, I had a full investigation team from Southern Net at my property. Our technicians documented the damage, filed a report, and sent it to the state's Public Utilities Commission. Cutting a registered communications line wasn't just an HOA violation, it was a state-level offense under utility interference laws. Karen didn't know it yet, but she just picked a fight with the wrong person. That day, as I stood there watching my crew splice and rejoin the line, I made myself a promise. I was going to teach Karen, and her little HOA board, a lesson they'd never forget. Not with anger, but with paperwork, legal power, and the kind of quiet vengeance that comes when you own the very network your enemy depends on. The next few days were a blur of logistics, legal filings, and a strangely intoxicating sense of control. I've always believed that people reveal their true priorities when the inconveniences start, and Maple Ridge's priorities became very visible, very quickly. The HOA board called an emergency meeting the night after I filed the report with the Public Utilities Commission. They sent a glossy pamphlet to every household accusing an outside provider of running cables without approval and insisting their actions were in the interest of community safety. Karen led every part of it with theatrical outrage, as if the whole neighborhood should be impressed by her vigilance. She paced in front of the folding table like a small-town magistrate, tapping a laser pointer at slides that painted me as a reckless corporate invader. I listened from the back, arms folded, watching the performance like it was some amateur theater production. When she called me out by name, "We'll be reviewing Mr. Anderson's unauthorized installations," a ripple of gasps and murmurs moved through the room. Some faces looked curious, others annoyed, and a few, I noticed, were puzzled because they'd been enjoying my service for months without realizing who was behind it. The evening's theatrics didn't change the facts. My technicians had documented the serial number on the utility box, the registration with the state, and the exact coordinates of the splice. The Public Utilities Commission opened a preliminary inquiry immediately. Interference with communications infrastructure isn't something regulators ignore, and with a complaint in hand, the board's removal for safety excuse looked thin. That said, I didn't want to settle things purely on paperwork. One thing I learned running Southern Net was that perception often matters as much as reality, and Karen's performance had infected the neighborhood narrative. If I wanted to restore the line and restore calm, I needed to control the story, not just the legal outcome. So I started playing two games at once. Game A was the quiet and clinical legal and regulatory push, incident reports, splicing logs, photographs, official letters demanding damages for the cost of emergency repairs and for the downtime my customers in the area had experienced. Game B was the human game, outreach, demonstration, and, yes, a bit of theater of my own, because stubborn egos sometimes require matching stubbornness. I scheduled a neighborhood connectivity day on a sunny Saturday and sent simple, friendly postcards to every house. "Come learn how your internet works, free coffee and donuts." The language was deliberately cheerful and non-threatening. A few neighbors called to ask what was happening, most were simply intrigued. On the day of the event, I set up a mobile demo van at the cul-de-sac, opened the hatch, and unrolled coax, fiber, and routers like a magician's props. We had a screen showing a simple visual of how the fiber ran into the pedestal, how the splice was made, and how the network served the neighborhood. Kids poked at the routers, teenagers played a lag-free multiplayer game projected on the wall, and a lot of adults asked practical questions about monthly bills, speeds, and whether streaming would finally work during the big game. People who'd been silently frustrated with buffering suddenly had faces. They met the people who built the network and realized their service wasn't some faceless enterprise. Word travels fast in small neighborhoods, and by the time Karen arrived, late, as always, the line of neighbors had grown into a cheerful cluster. She stood at the edge of the group, arms crossed, eyes narrowed like someone watching a satisfying redundancy being dismantled. When she approached me, I handed her a fresh cup of coffee and smiled. "Morning," I said. "We wanted to show folks why that little green box matters." She sniffed and attempted to lecture the assembled crowd about unauthorized infrastructure, but the dynamic had shifted. Half the people in front of her were my customers, the very same neighbors she claimed to protect. A retired couple from 2 doors down, who I'd installed service for free during their recovery from surgery, stepped forward and told Karen, in a voice that left no room for argument, that they'd lost their remote monitoring during the outage and that my techs had been the only ones to help them that week. Another neighbor, a schoolteacher, thanked me for donating bandwidth to her online class during a storm. Each genuine, personal testimony chipped away at Karen's authority until she looked uncomfortably small. That day, the HOA board realized it couldn't have it both ways. They couldn't publicly humiliate the neighborhood's lifeline and also expect the same residents to applaud them. After the demo, the mood in Maple Ridge changed from suspicious to skeptical of the board's unilateral actions. The Public Utilities Commission, after reviewing our documentation, ruled that the HOA's maintenance team had acted outside their jurisdiction and ordered the HOA to cease interference with registered utilities immediately. They also opened an inquiry into the HOA's authorization process and asked the board to provide records of complaints and approvals for their past actions. That is the sort of administrative headache that makes volunteer board members suddenly run for cover. But Karen didn't retreat gracefully. Instead, she doubled down in private channels, sending aggressive emails to the board accusing me of intimidation and using corporate resources to influence HOA votes. She demanded a formal cease and desist and sent a lawyer's letter threatening to sue SouthernNet for trespassing on common property. Her tone became increasingly paranoid. Her emails were heavy on phrases like, "without prejudice," and "we reserve all rights," the sort of legal theater that often means someone is bluffing. I forwarded a copy of one such letter to our legal counsel and then, because I believed in undermining hostility with transparency, replied to the HOA's full membership with a calm, factual message. I explained the situation in plain language, what the line was, why it was placed where it was, and how cutting it endangered both residents and infrastructure. I attached photos, the PUC preliminary ruling, and an offer. If the HOA wishes, SouthernNet will work with their board and the neighborhood to formalize an installation plan that respects HOA guidelines while protecting resident services. It was the right mixture of firmness and olive branch. People don't like being manipulated. My neighbor outreach made it clear that Karen's choice had hurt real people, and the HOA's attempt to weaponize rules against a utility provider now looked petty. Several board members, uncomfortable with the regulatory scrutiny and the growing chorus of neighbors on my side, quietly asked Karen to tone down her rhetoric. That didn't stop her from attempting one last, desperate maneuver, a smear campaign. She started whispering to anyone who would listen that SouthernNet was an unstable startup, that my cheap installations would lower property values, and that they should be wary of corporate influence in community affairs. It was the sort of fearful, small-minded suggestion that usually loses traction when placed against actual facts, but it did have the advantage of appealing to people who feared change. To counter that, I organized a brief, neighbor-led Q&A at the community center with an independent local consumer advocate and one of our own engineers. We focused on transparency, cost breakdowns, maintenance schedules, and what the HOA could reasonably and legally ask of providers working on common property. The advocate explained rights of way and the limitations of HOA authority in language even a non-technical person could follow. He also emphasized that property values are more influenced by reliable utilities than by whether a cable is perfectly hidden on day one, a point the audience absorbed with visible relief. In that setting, Karen's efforts to paint me as a villain felt increasingly shrill, and one by one, homeowners who had been on the fence publicly expressed support for formalizing an agreement with SouthernNet rather than expending further energy fighting the service that actually kept their families connected. That was the tactical win, but a personal lesson came with it. Power isn't just about who's right on paper, it's about who can win hearts and minds. Karen had relied on bureaucratic muscle and intimidation. I relied on competence, helpfulness, and making the invisible visible. By providing practical assistance, by explaining rather than scolding, the narrative flipped. People who'd once nodded at Karen's clipped edicts now shook hands with my technicians and invited them over for barbecues. The PTA president asked if we could sponsor a Wi-Fi hotspot for the playground during after-school programs. The result was that by the time the PUC issued its formal finding, that the HOA had acted improperly and must reimburse SouthernNet for damages and emergency service costs, the neighborhood reaction was more embarrassed than outraged. Karen's attempt to assert dominance had left her isolated. Even so, Karen's ego wouldn't accept a quiet defeat. She started showing up at board meetings with increasingly petty new bylaws drafted in legal-sounding language. No cables shall traverse common areas without prior express written consent, a clause that sounds reasonable until you recognize that the board hadn't actually created a process to grant such consent and that many legitimate utilities rely on long-established easements and rights-of-way. Her new rules were a patchwork intended to create paperwork friction rather than safety. But the world works in patterns, and repetition breeds familiarity. Her repeated attempts to micromanage utilities and harass contractors finally drew the attention of a state-level mediator who specializes in HOA conflicts. That mediator suggested a mediated settlement, formalized the utility access policy, reimburse the costs I'd incurred, and create a joint committee of residents, HOA members, and utility providers to vet future work. It was a fair compromise that would protect residents and remove unilateral power from the board. By the end of the month, we had a signed settlement. The HOA would pay for emergency repair costs, cancel any punitive notices sent to residents who used my service, and adopt a transparent process for approving infrastructure that included public notices and reasonable timelines. They even agreed to let me run a quarterly infrastructure open house, where residents could meet technicians and ask questions. Karen signed the agreement with a tight face, but her signature was there. I could have celebrated, and I did, quietly, but the settlement also made me realize something deeper. Owning the internet in a community doesn't mean wielding it as a weapon. It means responsibility. I'd started this whole thing angry, ready to punish a petty tyrant who'd cut a fiber line, but as things cooled, I understood that long-term stability required collaboration. The settlement didn't strip me of power, it reframed it. SouthernNet would be a partner, not a conqueror. Still, I couldn't resist a final bit of poetic justice. At the first infrastructure open house, after the settlement, I set up a little display titled, "What Happens When Someone Cuts the Internet?" It included a photo of the sinewy, sheared fiber with Karen's HOA letter tucked into the box, a mock-up of the emergency repair invoice, and a short video of the domino effects we tracked: elderly residents missing telemedicine calls, a home business losing a delivery window, a kid who'd had to reschedule an online audition. I didn't point fingers. I let the evidence do the talking. People looked at the display and then at Karen, who stood by the refreshments with a plate of cookies like any other hostess, but this time, the polite smiles directed at her felt a little measured. Maple Ridge had learned something hard and small at once: infrastructure is boring until it fails, and when it does, everyone notices who built it. And somewhere in the bowels of SouthernNet's billing system, a new entry was made: Maple Ridge, formalized access, community liaison assigned. It was bureaucratic, sure, but it meant we'd turned chaos into a stable system. Karen could write bylaws till her pen ran dry, but the network beneath our feet, officially registered and legally protected, would continue humming. That hum was more satisfying than revenge. It was the sound of people's lives continuing on, uninterrupted, which, when you run an internet company, is the kind of quiet victory you live for. By the time summer rolled around, the whole Karen episode had become something of a neighborhood legend. People still whispered about it, laughing softly when they passed by the green utility box near my lawn, now firmly sealed, relabeled, and locked with a reinforced tamper-proof cap. The HOA's overreach had turned into a cautionary tale about why you don't mess with things you don't understand. For a while, I actually thought peace had returned to Maple Ridge. My business was stable, our customer base was growing, and most of the residents treated me with a kind of friendly respect that came from knowing I'd stood up for something that benefited everyone. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that people like Karen never stay quiet for long. For them, control isn't just a habit, it's oxygen. And the moment you take it away, they start gasping. It began subtly, as these things always do. Small, passive-aggressive gestures, forgotten invitations to HOA meetings, sudden reminders about lawn maintenance schedules, little flyers taped to my door that outlined community appearance guidelines, all signed off with, the HOA. I knew the tone. It was Karen's voice disguised in bureaucratic politeness. I ignored it at first. Then came the anonymous complaints, about my unapproved solar panels, about my security cameras facing public areas, even about the size of my mailbox. Every one of those things was compliant, legal, and, ironically, installed to the exact specifications the HOA required. But it wasn't about the rules. It was about reminding me that she still existed in the system. I stayed calm, focused on my work. SouthernNet had just landed a major municipal contract, and I was spending long hours coordinating fiber expansions into nearby rural areas. But as I spent more time at the office, Karen found ways to make her presence felt at home. One afternoon, I returned to find a bright orange notice of infraction taped to my garage door. It accused me of unauthorized utility activity, a direct violation of the very settlement agreement we'd signed 2 months prior. My first reaction was disbelief. My second was quiet amusement. I walked over to the green box, inspected it, and found that someone, again, had tampered with the lock. This time, the cut wasn't clean. It looked like someone had tried to pry it open with a screwdriver, failed, and left scratches along the side. Whoever it was had also unplugged one of the fiber access points, a small move, but enough to cause temporary service disruption. I didn't have to be a detective to figure out who'd done it. There were only 2 sets of footprints in the soft soil. One was clearly from a flat, heeled shoe. Karen's favorite brand of garden clogs. I smiled grimly and turned on my camera system, scrolling through the motion-activated footage from earlier that morning. And there it was, Karen herself, bending over the utility box, muttering to herself, trying to yank the lock open before giving up and stomping away in frustration. The footage was as clear as daylight. That evening, I decided I'd had enough. I invited her and the entire HOA board to my house for what I called a clarification meeting. To her credit, she showed up, though the confidence in her stride had dimmed since our last face-off. The rest of the board arrived too, looking equal parts nervous and curious. I led them out to the yard, where a small projector screen was set up beside the utility box. With a remote in hand, I pressed play. The footage rolled silently. Karen crouched down, fiddling with the box, pulling, pushing, and finally storming off. When it ended, I didn't say a word. The silence was heavier than any accusation I could make. Her face turned a deep shade of red. That's not what it looks like," she stammered. "Oh?" I asked calmly. "Because it looks like the president of the HOA is tampering with a state-protected utility again, even after a signed legal settlement." "I was checking for safety," she snapped, her voice trembling with that mix of anger and embarrassment that only comes from being caught. "Safety?" I echoed. "Funny, because the only unsafe thing here is your repeated interference with federal communication lines." The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. One of them, a middle-aged man named Doug, finally spoke. "Karen," he said carefully, "this is serious. We can't be part of this again. The HOA can't afford another complaint." Karen shot him a glare that could melt steel, but the damage was done. The rest of the board nodded in agreement. For once, I didn't have to say a thing. Her peers were doing it for me. I turned to them, kept my voice calm and professional. "Look, I don't want to escalate this," I said. "But if this continues, I'll have no choice but to file another complaint with the PUC and law enforcement. I'd also hate for this footage to become public record, which, as you know, it would be during an investigation." Karen's jaw clenched so tightly I could hear her teeth grind. She muttered something about misunderstandings and overreactions, but she didn't have the strength to fight this time. She knew she was cornered. After that meeting, she disappeared from public view for a while. I thought maybe she'd finally learned her lesson. For a few blessed months, Maple Ridge was quiet. The HOA functioned smoothly under Doug's temporary leadership. They handled community events, coordinated landscaping, and even started collaborating with my company to improve public Wi-Fi coverage in the park. People were happier. The constant tension that had hung over the neighborhood began to lift. But Karen wasn't gone, not really. Like a virus that mutates, she returned in a new form. This time, her attacks came through social media. Someone, clearly her, started a Facebook group called Maple Ridge Watchdogs, dedicated to holding residents accountable for maintaining community standards. At first, it seemed harmless, just the usual neighborhood chatter about pets, lost packages, and yard sales. But soon, it turned toxic. Posts began to appear targeting certain homeowners who think they're above the rules, accompanied by blurry photos of my house taken from across the street. Comments poured in, mostly from fake-looking accounts, complaining about noise, construction, and increased traffic. I wasn't stupid, I could see it for what it was, a smear campaign designed to turn public sentiment against me again. I could have ignored it, but I chose a different approach. I went live. Literally. I started a weekly live stream series called Behind the Connection, where I explained internet maintenance, neighborhood infrastructure, and cybersecurity tips, all filmed from my garage studio, with the same friendly, casual tone I'd used during our community demo. It wasn't confrontational, it was educational. But every time someone from the Watchdogs group posted something false, I'd debunk it indirectly during my next stream, showing clear data, footage, and facts without naming names. People quickly caught on. My audience grew. Within a month, half the neighborhood followed the series, and even residents from nearby communities tuned in. What Karen intended as a character assassination campaign had turned into free marketing for Southern Net, and a personal platform that strengthened my bond with the entire town. But Karen's ego couldn't stand that. She began posting increasingly desperate things, claiming my company was spying on residents through routers, that I was harvesting data, even that I bribed the HOA board. The absurdity would have been funny if it weren't so malicious. Eventually, the local paper picked up on the drama, writing a short piece titled, HOA Dispute Goes Digital, Local Internet Provider versus HOA President. The article wasn't biased, but it quoted both sides, including Karen's rants, which, printed in black and white, made her sound completely unhinged. That article was the final nail in her social coffin. Within a week, the HOA board formally voted to remove her from her position. It wasn't even close, unanimous decision. The community couldn't afford her instability anymore. She was forced to step down, effective immediately. When the notice went out, there was no fanfare, no confrontation, just quiet relief across Maple Ridge. I saw her once after that, standing at her window as I walked my dog. She didn't wave. She didn't glare either. She just looked, defeated. For a moment, I almost felt bad. Almost. But then I remembered the cut cables, the anonymous notes, the threats, and the chaos she caused, and that sympathy faded fast. After her departure, the community flourished. Without her constant interference, residents began volunteering more, organizing local cleanups, and even holding small festivals in the park. SouthernNet partnered with the HOA to install free Wi-Fi for public areas, something I'd proposed a year earlier, back when Karen had dismissed it as corporate meddling. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. That fall, as I watched families gather for the annual autumn fair, kids running around with painted faces, parents chatting happily, the Wi-Fi network humming perfectly in the background, I realized something profound. Winning wasn't about revenge or humiliation. It was about reclaiming peace. About proving that power misused eventually collapses under its own weight. Karen had ruled through fear and control, I'd won through patience, transparency, and persistence. Still, I wasn't naive. People like her always look for one last spark of relevance. And deep down, I suspected that this story, my story, wasn't quite finished yet. Because in small towns like Maple Ridge, grudges don't die easily. Sometimes, they just go underground, like the cables beneath our feet, waiting for the next surge to bring them roaring back to life. It's funny how silence can feel suspicious once you've lived through chaos. For a few blissful months, Maple Ridge ran like a dream. The HOA board, under Doug's level-headed leadership, focused on actual community improvements, new benches by the lake, repainted crosswalks, even a small fund to support elderly residents with home repairs. The air felt lighter. Neighbors who'd once whispered gossip now waved cheerfully as I passed by with my dog, Milo. And for the first time since moving in, I started to believe that the suburban dream I'd been chasing might finally be real. I spent my evenings grilling in the backyard, listening to the hum of the routers from the neighborhood Wi-Fi system, a network that had become both my pride and my quiet reminder of what patience could build. But peace in Maple Ridge never lasted long. The first sign that something was off came one Friday evening when my lead technician, Sam, called me about a strange spike in network traffic. "Hey, boss," he said, his voice tense. "We're getting unusual requests from Maple Ridge nodes. Like, thousands of data pings hitting the access point near your address, almost like someone's trying to scan the network." I frowned. Could it be a misconfigured device? I asked. "Unlikely," he replied. "These are systematic. Random IP sweeps. Someone's probing the infrastructure." Now, I'd seen enough network attacks to know when someone was up to no good. These weren't kids fooling around. The source looked local, not from outside the system. Someone inside Maple Ridge was deliberately testing the network's vulnerabilities. My instincts screamed one name, Karen. But she'd been removed months ago, and I hadn't heard a word from her since. Still, that kind of obsessive personality doesn't just evaporate. I told Sam to flag every incoming request, trace the origin, and log all unusual activity for the next 72 hours. By the next morning, the logs told a story. The probing wasn't random, it was coming from a very specific address in the neighborhood. The packets originated from a house on Lakeview Drive, registered to none other than Karen L. Wilkins. My stomach dropped. She was back. Not as HOA president this time, but as something far more dangerous, a saboteur working from the shadows. Instead of confronting her immediately, I decided to observe. I wanted evidence, not assumptions. I spent the next week quietly monitoring the network activity. Karen's address showed up on every report, sometimes late at night, sometimes early in the morning. She wasn't just scanning, she was attempting to access internal admin panels through brute force attacks. It wasn't sophisticated, but it was persistent. And that persistence worried me more than any hacker ever had. It wasn't about stealing data, it was about disruption. She wanted revenge. On the fifth night, she went too far. Around 2 a.m., our monitoring system triggered an emergency alert, unauthorized access attempt, fiber node failure. I threw on a jacket and drove out. The glow from the streetlights illuminated the green box near my lawn, the same one she'd attacked before. The lock had been smashed open again, wires dangling loose, and a faint spark flickered inside. Whoever had done it had used metal tools carelessly, shorting one of the live signal lines. It wasn't just vandalism anymore, it was dangerous. I called the police. This wasn't just my property, it was tampering with state-registered infrastructure again. When the officers arrived, I explained the situation calmly, showed them the access logs, the video footage from my security cameras, and the last repair report. They examined the box, noted the damage, and filed an official report. But when I gave them the address I suspected, their tone changed slightly. "You're saying this woman has done this before?" one of them asked. "Yes," I said. "There's a legal settlement. You can check with the Public Utilities Commission." The officers took it seriously. They knocked on Karen's door that same night. I stood a few houses down, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold under the streetlights. Karen opened the door wearing a robe, pretending to be confused and indignant. "What's this about?" I could hear her say. I've been asleep. But the officers weren't buying it. When they showed her the printed network logs and surveillance stills of her walking toward my property earlier that night, her face drained of color. "That's not me," she stammered. That's someone who looks like me." They didn't arrest her immediately, but they did issue her a warning and told her she could face felony charges if the investigation confirmed her involvement. I thought that would be enough to finally end it. I was wrong. The next week, the Watchdogs Facebook group sprang back to life, this time under a different name, Maple Ridge Transparency Network. It was clearly her, the same tone, same writing style, same obsession. Except now, instead of petty accusations, she'd taken things further. She started spreading conspiracy theories about Southern Net, claiming we'd planted surveillance equipment in the utility boxes, that we were spying on residents' conversations, and that certain board members were in on it. It was laughable, but in today's world, even ridiculous lies find believers. A handful of gullible residents began posting paranoid comments, demanding an independent audit of the neighborhood's internet lines. Doug, now permanently acting as HOA president, called me in frustration. "Mark," he sighed, "this woman's driving us insane. Half the neighborhood believes her nonsense. Is there any way to put this to rest?" I thought about it for a while, then smiled. "Actually," I said, "yes. Let's show them what the truth looks like, publicly." The next weekend, I hosted what I called the Fiber Fair. It was half education, half festival. Southern Net sponsored food trucks, local bands, and tech demos. But the main attraction was a live, guided tour of the neighborhood's internet infrastructure. I brought in my engineers, local officials, and a representative from the Public Utilities Commission. We opened the utility boxes, under official supervision, and explained how every connection worked, how data was encrypted, and how we legally couldn't, and wouldn't, monitor anyone's private usage. Everything was transparent. We even had a section explaining common myths, including one slide that simply said, "No, we are not spying on you, Karen." That one got a laugh big enough to echo through the park. Karen didn't show up, of course, but that didn't stop the event from dismantling her lies completely. Local news covered the story again, this time with a much clearer narrative: community unites to support internet provider after HOA scandal. The piece painted Southern Net, and me, as the reasonable, community-minded side of the story. The police investigation continued quietly in the background, and eventually, they gathered enough evidence to confirm Karen's involvement in the latest line damage. She was charged with misdemeanor vandalism and interfering with utility infrastructure, charges that carried fines, community service, and a restraining order preventing her from coming within 500 feet of any Southern Net property. The day that restraining order became official was the first day I truly exhaled. It was over. The endless cycle of harassment, sabotage, and manipulation had finally reached its legal conclusion. For the first time in nearly 2 years, I could walk outside without wondering if someone had tampered with the cables beneath my feet. In the months that followed, Maple Ridge transformed completely. The HOA, humbled by the ordeal, restructured its policies. Doug officially took over as president, and he led with fairness, not fear. They implemented a resident feedback board, allowing homeowners to vote on initiatives instead of being dictated to. The change was remarkable. It felt like the neighborhood had collectively grown up, like everyone had learned that power without accountability eventually eats itself. Southern Net became a trusted name not just in Maple Ridge, but in surrounding communities too. Word of mouth spread fast, the company that stood up to an HOA bully and came out stronger for it. We expanded operations, launched new pilot projects, and even started community workshops on digital literacy. I'd walk through the neighborhood now and see kids doing homework on the Wi-Fi network I'd built, retirees streaming their favorite shows without a glitch, and small businesses thriving thanks to reliable internet access. And sometimes, when the light hit the green utility box just right, I'd think back to that first day, to Karen's smirk as she told me to reroute my unauthorized line. The irony still made me smile. She'd tried to cut my connection, but in doing so, she'd connected me more deeply to this community than I ever expected. Her war made me the very thing she feared most, an unshakable part of Maple Ridge's foundation. There's a strange satisfaction in knowing that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it hums quietly beneath the surface, steady, unbreakable, and undeniable. My network hummed like that every night now, a soft, glowing reminder that truth, once established, doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stay connected. You'd think after everything that happened, the sabotage, the lawsuits, the drama, that life in Maple Ridge would finally settle into that picture-perfect calm the brochures always promised. For a while, it did. I'd wake up early, take Milo for a walk around the lake, sip coffee on the porch, and actually smile when I saw my neighbors. The HOA, once a nest of control and gossip, had turned into a genuine community effort. People cared again, not about the color of each other's mailboxes or the length of the grass, but about living peacefully. It was what I'd wanted from the start, a place where I could blend my work with a quiet life. But fate has a dark sense of humor. It wasn't long before I realized that Karen's influence hadn't disappeared, it had simply shifted. Like a bad signal that kept trying to reconnect, her chaos had echoes that still bounced around the neighborhood. You could see it in the suspicious whispers that flared up every now and then, in the way a few residents eyed me as if I was part of some grand scheme. Karen's conspiracy theories had infected more than just a Facebook group, they'd planted seeds of doubt that refused to die easily. One afternoon, as I was returning from the Southern Net regional office, I noticed a moving truck parked 2 houses down from mine. A "sold" sign stood crooked in the yard. A woman was directing the movers, her voice sharp and familiar. My stomach sank as she turned, that unmistakable platinum hair, that pinched expression. Karen. I stood frozen for a few seconds, my pulse pounding in my ears. How could this even be possible? The restraining order should have kept her far away from here. I walked over, trying to keep my voice calm. Karen, I said, what are you doing here? She looked up at me with that smug half-smile I remembered all too well. Relax, Mark, she said. I didn't buy this house. My sister did. I'm just helping her move in. Totally legal. Her tone dripped with mock innocence, but her eyes gleamed with malice. She knew exactly what she was doing, finding the one loophole that would let her inch back into my life. I could have called the police right then, but I didn't. Part of me didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing me rattle. Instead, I nodded coolly and said, fine. But I'll be keeping an eye out. She chuckled. Oh, I'm sure you will. That's kind of your thing, isn't it? Watching everything. That night, I sat in my office, staring at the security feeds. I'd upgraded everything after her last stunt, motion sensors, infrared cameras, tamper alarms on the fiber boxes. It wasn't paranoia, it was protection. But as I watched the monitors, I realized something deeper, this wasn't about a feud anymore. Karen's obsession wasn't with me personally. It was with control. Losing her HOA throne had shattered her, and she was grasping for power in any way she could. Days passed. Her sister, a quiet woman named Judy, seemed harmless enough, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that Karen was using her as a front. Soon enough, strange things started happening again. Minor, almost petty incidents, unexplained service interruptions, residents complaining that their routers were acting weird, and a few network nodes suddenly dropping connection overnight. My tech team ran diagnostics, but every time we fixed one issue, another popped up elsewhere. It was like playing digital whack-a-mole. One night, while checking the maintenance logs, I spotted something odd: a maintenance request filed through an internal portal using an old, inactive employee ID. The job was marked as completed, but I hadn't authorized it. The request's location? The network hub right behind Judy's property. My patience snapped. The next morning, I showed up with my maintenance crew and a sheriff's deputy, just in case. When we reached the hub, the padlock was cleanly cut again. Inside, the connections had been tampered with, rerouted to a separate line that fed directly into Judy's house. Someone had literally tapped into the fiber. My tech leaned over the open box, whistling low. "This is professional work," he said. Someone knew what they were doing. Karen came storming out almost on cue. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice rising. "You can't just barge onto private property." I gestured toward the open hub. "Tampering with a registered utility line is a federal offense, Karen. Whoever did this used credentials from my company's internal system. That's not private property, that's theft." Her eyes flickered, and for the first time, I saw something I hadn't before: not confidence, not rage, but fear. "You can't prove it was me," she spat. "You're just trying to frame me again because you can't stand strong women standing up to you." The sheriff, a solid man named Hal who'd been part of the earlier investigation, held up his hand. "Ma'am," he said sternly, "this is an active investigation. I suggest you step back." Karen glared at him, then turned on her heel and stormed inside. By that evening, I'd collected all the evidence I needed. The network logs showed unauthorized device connections originating from Judy's IP address. The internal system access had been traced back to a compromised password belonging to an employee who'd left 2 years earlier, someone Karen had tried to contact during her last investigation. The case was airtight. 2 days later, she was arrested, again. This time, there was no slap on the wrist. The charges were far more serious: cyber intrusion, wire fraud, and tampering with telecommunications infrastructure. When the news broke, the story exploded across local media. The headline read, "Former HOA President Arrested for Internet Sabotage, Again." The court hearings were long, drawn out, and exhausting. Karen tried everything: denial, emotional manipulation, even claiming I'd hacked her devices to frame her. But technology doesn't lie. Every bite of evidence told the same story. When the verdict finally came in, guilty on multiple counts, I didn't feel triumph. I just felt relief. Karen was sentenced to 18 months in a minimum security facility and ordered to pay restitution for damages to Southern Net. Her sister, who turned out to have known more than she admitted, quietly moved out of Maple Ridge within a month. The neighborhood sighed collectively, a long, overdue exhale. After the dust settled, I took a walk through the neighborhood at dusk. The sun dipped low behind the rows of neatly kept homes, and the air smelled of fresh-cut grass and barbecue. Milo trotted beside me, tail wagging lazily. I passed the park where the fiber fair had taken place months earlier. Kids were laughing, families chatting, lights twinkling softly from the lampposts, all powered, connected, and alive through the very system Karen had tried to destroy. Doug caught up to me near the corner. "You know," he said, "I think you've done more for this place than any HOA president ever did." I laughed softly. "Let's just hope we can keep it that way." He nodded. "We will. You showed people that standing up to bullies, even the ones with clipboards, actually matters." As I reached my driveway, I glanced at the utility box one last time. It hummed steadily under the warm glow of the streetlight, perfectly intact, perfectly connected. It had survived storms, sabotage, and countless attempts to silence it, just like me. That night, sitting on my porch, I thought about how this all started: one cable line, one angry neighbor, and one simple misunderstanding about who really held the power. Karen had believed she could cut my connection to control me. What she never understood was that my connection wasn't just in the cables or routers, it was in the people, in the community that rallied together when she tried to tear it apart. I raised my glass, letting the sound of the network's gentle hum drift through the quiet night. "Here's to good connections," I murmured. Milo barked once, as if agreeing. And for the first time in a long, long while, I felt at peace, not just because the battle was over, but because I knew I'd built something stronger than revenge, a neighborhood that finally understood the true meaning of being connected.